Hello and welcome to the Vailrun Tapes. Every story here is true. It happened to a real person, and they wrote it down or said it out loud, so the rest of us would know. Tonight, I'll share a few of them with you. A lot of you come back here every night, and that means a lot to me. These stories stay with people. That's just what they do. Before we start, drop a comment and tell me where you're listening from tonight. I read all of them. And if you like these stories, a quick like and subscribe really help. Now get comfortable, take a slow breath, and let's begin.
I'm keeping the mystery grounded. No creature sighting, no false evidence, only the missing carcass, the camera gap, and the unanswered question. My father and I hunt deer together every fall, and we have always processed the animals ourselves at home. It is something we have done for years. We take the usable meat, package it carefully, clean our equipment, and make sure as little as possible goes to waste. Once we finish, we are left with the parts that cannot be used. Instead of throwing them into regular rubbish or leaving them anywhere near the house, we take the remains to a place deep in the woods. The location is far from our neighbors and away from any roads or walking paths. It is not somewhere a person would reach by accident. You have to know where you are going, and even then, it takes some effort to get there. The area is surrounded by thick trees and heavy undergrowth. In the fall, the ground is usually covered with dead leaves, broken branches, and patches of damp soil. It is quiet enough that you can hear small animals moving through the brush long before you see them. We chose that place because it was isolated, and because nature could take care of what we left behind. Animals would feed, insects would do their part, and eventually the remains would return to the earth. That was the idea, anyway. Over the years, we brought several deer carcasses to the same general area. We never piled them directly on top of each other, but we used that part of the woods often enough that I expected to see some evidence of the older ones. I thought there would be bones, maybe a skull somewhere beneath the leaves, maybe part of a spine. At the very least, I expected to find a few scattered pieces that larger animals had dragged away and left behind. But we never did. Every time we returned, the area looked clean. Not cleaned in the way a person would clean it, of course. There were still leaves, dirt, fallen branches, animal tracks, and all the usual signs of the forest. What was strange was that there never seemed to be any sign of the carcasses. They did not simply decay where we left them. They vanished. At first, we did not think much about it. The woods are full of scavengers. Coyotes, foxes, raccoons, birds, insects, and other animals can strip a carcass quickly. Larger predators can drag heavy remains surprising distances. Even smaller animals can scatter bones over a wide area. There was no reason to assume anything strange was happening. Still, I was curious. I wanted to know which animals were doing it. We had never actually seen anything feeding on the remains. We had never found a clear trail showing where a carcass had been dragged. We had never come across a group of coyotes or seen large birds gathered in the trees above the site. The carcasses simply disappeared between visits. I started wondering what happened in that part of the woods after we left. How long did it take for the animals to arrive? Did they come at night? Was it one large animal doing most of the work, or many smaller animals over several days? Did the same scavengers return every season because they had learned that food sometimes appeared there? The easiest way to answer those questions was to set up a trail camera. Trail cameras are useful because they can sit in one place for days or weeks and record movement without anyone being there. The camera I used had a motion sensor. Whenever something moved in front of it, the sensor would trigger, and the camera would take a series of 3 pictures. That seemed perfect. If a coyote came to the carcass, I would get 3 images. If several animals arrived, I would see them. If birds landed on it during the day, the camera would capture them as well. I did not expect anything unusual. I honestly thought I would end up with a simple collection of wildlife pictures. I imagined showing my father a few photographs of coyotes pulling at the remains or raccoons climbing over them. It would finally solve the small mystery we had talked about for years. After one of our hunts, we finished processing the deer as usual. When everything usable had been removed and stored, we took the remaining carcass out to the woods. The trip was the same as it had always been. We carried it far from the house, reached our usual disposal area, and placed it on the ground. Then I set up the camera. I chose a tree with a clear view of the carcass and attached the camera securely to the trunk. I made sure it was facing the right direction and that the remains were near the center of the frame. I checked the angle. I checked the sensor. I made sure the SD card was inside. Then I tested it. The camera appeared to be working normally. There were branches and leaves in the area, but that is difficult to avoid in the woods. I expected the camera to take some useless pictures when the wind moved the vegetation. That happens with trail cameras all the time. Still, I believed there would be enough clear images to show what visited the carcass. Once everything was ready, I left. For the next few days, the camera remained alone in the woods. I did not check it immediately because I wanted to give the animals time to find the remains. Going back too soon might leave more human scent in the area and make cautious wildlife stay away. So I waited. During that time, I kept thinking about what the camera might capture. Coyotes were the most obvious possibility. A group of them could remove a lot of meat quickly and drag parts away. There were also smaller scavengers that might feed throughout the night. I thought I might see deer investigating the smell, although they would probably keep their distance. There was even a chance of seeing a larger animal, depending on what moved through that area. Whatever appeared, I expected the camera to show the process clearly. Something would arrive. It would feed. Other animals would join it. The remains would become smaller over time. Eventually, the bones would be dragged away or scattered. That was what I wanted to see. After a few days, I returned to the site. The woods looked normal as I approached. There were no animals nearby, no unusual sounds, and nothing that immediately made me think something was wrong. Then, I reached the place where we had left the carcass. It was gone. Not mostly gone. Not stripped down to bone. Completely gone. There was no skull, no ribs, no spine, no hide, no legs. There were not even small pieces scattered around the area. I looked at the ground where it had been placed. I expected to see blood, disturbed leaves, drag marks, tracks, or some clear sign that animals had fed there. There was almost nothing. The leaves did not appear heavily torn apart. The soil did not show an obvious trail leading away. I walked around the area and searched in wider circles. I checked behind trees and inside thick brush. I looked downhill, where gravity might have helped move the remains. I looked for bone fragments, hair, or anything else that could show which direction it had gone. There was no clear evidence. It was as if the carcass had never been there. That was strange, but not impossible. Animals can be surprisingly efficient, especially when several species feed on the same remains. The ground can also hide signs quickly. Leaves fall, wind moves debris, and tracks become difficult to read. The camera was still attached to the tree. That was what mattered. Even if the forest had erased the physical evidence, the camera should have recorded everything. I removed it and took the SD card home. I was looking forward to seeing the pictures. The camera had taken around 5,000 images. That was far more than I expected. At first, I thought the high number meant the site had been very active. Maybe animals had visited constantly. Maybe there had been a feeding group large enough to keep triggering the camera. But when I started looking through the files, Most of them showed nothing. The frame was empty. The carcass was there, but there were no visible animals. In some images, leaves had shifted. In others, a branch had moved slightly. The wind had probably caused most of the triggers. Because the camera took 3 pictures each time, even one moving leaf could create a large number of files over several days. I started going through them one by one. It became repetitive very quickly. Carcass, leaves, trees, nothing, then another set. Carcass, leaves, empty woods. Again and again, the same scene appeared. I kept looking because I assumed the useful pictures would eventually show up. There had to be something. The carcass was gone when I returned, so at some point, an animal must have entered the frame. I expected to find coyotes first. Maybe a raccoon, maybe a fox. I thought there would be a clear series showing the first scavenger arriving. But there was nothing. For a long time, the carcass remained visible in the middle of the frame. Then I noticed something that did not make sense. There was a gap in the timestamps. It was about 1 hour. Before the gap, the carcass was still there. The camera had taken its normal sets of images. The remains were visible in the center. There were no animals around it. Then the next available pictures were taken roughly an hour later. In those images, the carcass was gone. There was no gradual change. There was no sequence showing scavengers tearing it apart. There was no image of an animal dragging it out of the frame. It was simply there in one group of pictures and missing in the next. I went back through the files. I thought I must have skipped something. With around 5,000 pictures, it was easy to miss a sequence or click past a few images too quickly. I checked the last photographs before the gap. The carcass was still clearly visible. I checked the first photographs after the gap. The ground was empty. I looked at the timestamps again. About an hour had passed. Somewhere inside that missing hour, the entire carcass had disappeared. The camera had recorded thousands of useless pictures because leaves moved in the wind. Yet it had somehow failed to capture the one event I had placed it there to record. That was the part I could not understand. Whatever removed the carcass had to enter the area. It had to get close enough to touch the remains. It then had to move the entire thing out of the camera's view. That should have triggered the sensor repeatedly. If several animals had fed on it, the camera should have taken hundreds of pictures. If one large animal had dragged it away, there should have been at least one set of 3 images showing part of the animal or the carcass moving. Instead, there was nothing. The last image before the gap looked normal. The first image after the gap showed an empty patch of ground. I checked whether the camera had been moved. The angle looked the same. The tree line had not shifted. The surrounding branches were still in roughly the same position. The frame had not suddenly pointed in a different direction and then returned. I also considered whether someone had taken the carcass. A person could have approached from behind the camera, walked around it, and removed the remains. But even then, it would have been difficult to avoid the sensor completely. The carcass was directly in front of the lens. Anyone picking it up would have entered the camera's detection area. There were no clear human footprints when I returned, although the ground was covered in leaves and might not have held tracks well. More importantly, there was no obvious reason for a person to go that deep into the woods and steal a deer carcass. It had no useful meat left. It was not valuable. The location was private and isolated. A stranger would first need to know it was there. I thought about possible camera problems. Maybe the battery had briefly failed. Maybe moisture affected it. Maybe there was an issue with the SD card. Maybe the sensors stopped working for an hour and then started again. That was possible. Trail cameras are not perfect. Technology fails, especially outside in cold, damp conditions. But it still felt strangely convenient. The camera worked before the carcass disappeared. It worked afterward. It took thousands of photographs of moving leaves. Yet during the exact period when something large entered the area and removed the remains, there was no record. I kept looking through the images, hoping I would find one frame that explained everything. Maybe a paw at the edge. Maybe the nose of a coyote. Maybe part of a person's coat. Maybe a blurred shape moving too quickly to identify. There was nothing useful. The woods looked empty. The carcass vanished between one set of pictures and the next. I showed the images to my father. We went through the same possibilities. Coyotes could have taken it. A bear or another large animal could have dragged it away. Someone might have found it. The camera might simply have malfunctioned. All of those explanations were more reasonable than anything supernatural, but none of them appeared in the photographs. We started joking about it. We said maybe we had our own backyard chupacabra. Maybe Bigfoot had found a free meal. The jokes were better than admitting how strange the situation felt. Of course, we did not truly believe a mythical creature had come out of the forest, removed the carcass, and somehow avoided the camera. At least I did not have evidence to believe that. There was no giant footprint, no strange hair, no glowing eyes in the darkness, no shadowy creature caught in a blurred photograph. The only evidence was an absence. A deer carcass was visible. Then there was an hour with no pictures. Then the carcass was gone. That was all. In some ways, that made it more unsettling. If the camera had captured a strange animal, I could study it. I could compare its size and shape with known wildlife. I could ask someone with more experience to identify it. If the camera had shown people, I would know someone else had found our disposal site. Even a clear mechanical failure would have been an answer. Instead, I was left with a missing hour. After that, I paid more attention whenever we returned to the area. I looked for bones. I searched farther from the usual spot. I checked places where an animal might drag remains to eat in safety. I never found the missing carcass. That does not mean it was not somewhere nearby. The forest is large, and a bone can disappear beneath leaves quickly. Animals can carry pieces in different directions, and smaller scavengers can destroy what remains over time. Still, I expected to find something. A skull is not easy to consume completely. Large leg bones do not vanish overnight. Yet we found no trace. The experience also made me think about all the earlier carcasses we had left there. We had always assumed ordinary wildlife removed them. That was probably true. But we had never seen the process. We had never found the bones. The one time I tried to document what happened, the camera failed during the most important hour. I do not claim that something paranormal lives in those woods. There is almost certainly a natural explanation. Nature is efficient, and wild animals do things people rarely witness. A determined predator can move a surprising amount of weight. A group of scavengers can reduce remains much faster than most people realize. Cameras also miss things. Sensors do not always activate. Batteries lose power. Memory cards can skip files or become corrupted. The simplest answer is probably that an animal removed the carcass while the camera was not functioning properly. But I still think about the timing. The camera took thousands of photographs. Most were triggered by almost nothing. A leaf shifted, and the sensor reacted. A branch moved, and the camera captured 3 pictures. The wind blew again, and it recorded another set. Then, something entered the area, reached the center of the frame, and removed an entire deer carcass. For that 1 hour, the camera recorded nothing. When it started working again, the ground was empty. No drag marks were visible in the pictures. No animal stood nearby. There were no birds waiting in the trees or scraps left behind. The scene looked almost exactly the same as it had before, except the carcass had disappeared. We still joke about our chupacabra or backyard squatch. It has become one of those family stories that sounds funny when told in daylight. We imagine some unknown creature watching us from the trees, waiting patiently until we leave, then coming down to collect whatever we bring. Maybe it knows where the camera is. Maybe it waits for the exact moment the equipment fails. That is only a joke. Probably the truth is much less dramatic and more frustrating. I set up the camera because I wanted to answer a simple question. What happens to the carcasses after we leave? I expected the woods to show me. Instead, I ended up with 5,000 pictures of almost nothing, one unexplained hour, and an empty patch of ground where an entire deer had been. Whatever took it left no evidence that I could find. No tracks, no bones, no clear trail, no picture, only a gap. And sometimes, when my father and I return to that quiet place deep in the woods, I still look between the trees and wonder what comes out after we leave. When I was about 5 years old, I had a small collection of dreams that repeated themselves over and over again. They were not always frightening dreams. Most of them were not even very exciting. They were simple scenes that would return every few nights or every few weeks, almost exactly the same each time. I did not understand why they kept repeating. At that age, I assumed everyone had dreams like that. I thought it was normal to fall asleep and return to the same places, meet the same people, and repeat the same actions as if my mind only knew a few stories. One of those dreams was especially ordinary. In the dream, I would be standing on a quiet road near a house. The house sat in front of a hill. There was a driveway beside it, and a pile of firewood could be seen outside. The area around the house felt rural and isolated. There were no busy streets, tall buildings, crowds, or other children nearby. I would walk up to the front door. Then, I would knock. A person would answer, and I would ask for some wood for a campfire. The person would direct me toward the driveway, where the firewood had been stored. I would collect the wood and leave. That was the entire dream. Nothing frightening happened. No one chased me. The house was not haunted. There was no hidden room, mysterious stranger, or terrible ending. I simply walked to a house, asked for firewood, took some from the driveway, and left. It was such a small and unimportant scene that I never understood why my mind kept returning to it. The details were always familiar. The shape of the house, the hill behind it, the position of the driveway, the place where the wood was kept, the feeling of standing at the front door. Each time the dream returned, I seemed to know exactly what I was supposed to do. I never became lost. I never wondered why I was there. I walked toward the house as if I had visited it many times before. I knocked, asked for the wood, collected it, and left. Then I would wake up. Because I was so young, I did not keep a written record of the dream. I did not draw the house or describe every detail to my parents. I only remembered it because it happened so often. After some time, the dream stopped. I cannot remember the exact age when I had it for the last time. Like most childhood dreams, it slowly disappeared from my life. I began having different dreams, and the repeating scenes became less common. Eventually, I stopped thinking about the house completely. Years passed. The dream became one of those distant childhood memories that only returns when something reminds you of it. It was not important enough to discuss, and there was no reason to believe it meant anything. It was only a dream. When I was 14, I traveled to Europe for the first time. I live in Canada, so this was a major trip for me. Until then, Europe had been a place I knew through photographs, television, school lessons, and other people's stories. Everything about the trip felt new. The landscape was different. The buildings were older. The roads, villages, and countryside did not look exactly like the places I knew at home. I was traveling as part of a camp group. The plan involved spending about a week boating down a river. It was the kind of trip that sounded exciting before it began and became much more tiring once we were actually doing it. We spent long periods outside, moving along the river and carrying the equipment we needed. We had to work together, follow instructions, and help with normal camp responsibilities. During the day, we traveled. At night, we stopped, organized our camp, prepared food, and rested. Because we were moving along a river, we did not stay in normal hotels or campsites every night. Sometimes we settled in open areas that were convenient and safe enough for the group. By the end of the week, everyone was tired. We had been traveling, carrying supplies, and spending most of our time outdoors. Small tasks that seemed easy at the beginning began to feel like extra work. When the boating part of the trip ended, our group settled in a clear area near a road. It was not in the middle of a town. The area was quiet, and there did not seem to be much nearby. We needed to make a campfire, which meant we needed wood. A few of us were divided into teams and sent out to find some. I was part of one of those teams. At first, we probably intended to search properly and collect fallen branches. That would have been the normal way to do it. But we were tired. After spending a week traveling down the river, none of us wanted to walk far through the area carrying pieces of wood. We became lazy and looked for an easier solution. There was a road near the place where we had settled, so we followed it. We had no real plan. We hoped we might find a house, farm, shed, or somewhere that had firewood available. The area felt remote. It was not the kind of place where you expected to walk a short distance and immediately find a shop. There were no large signs advertising camping supplies. We were simply following a quiet road and hoping to find something useful. By chance, we eventually came across a few houses. They seemed to be in the middle of nowhere. I had never been to that area before. This was my first trip to Europe, and I had no family connection to the place. I had not seen the road on television or studied the local houses online. There was no reason for anything there to feel familiar. But as we continued walking, I began to experience a strange feeling. At first, it was weak. I looked at the road and thought something about it seemed known to me. I could not immediately explain why. The feeling was similar to déjà vu, but stronger and more specific. It was not simply the sense that I had done something before. I felt as though I knew what I was about to see. Then a house came into view. The moment I saw it, something changed. I recognized it. That sounds impossible, and at first I told myself I was mistaken. It was probably only similar to another house I had seen. Rural homes often share the same general features. There may be a driveway, a sloping roof, some trees, and open land nearby. Perhaps my mind was connecting random details. But as we moved closer, more of the scene appeared. There was a hill behind the house. The driveway was in the same position I remembered. There was firewood beside it. I stopped feeling as though the place was merely familiar. I knew it. It was the house from my childhood dream. The realization did not happen all at once. It arrived in pieces. First the road, then the house, then the hill, then the driveway, then the wood. Every new detail matched something I had seen repeatedly when I was about 5 years old. I began to feel uncomfortable. I had not thought about that dream for years. But suddenly, the memory returned with surprising clarity. I remembered walking toward the door. I remembered knocking. I remembered asking for firewood. I remembered being directed toward the driveway. Now, at 14 years old, on my first trip to Europe, I was standing in front of the same scene. I did not know what to say to the others, To them, we had only found a house that might have extra wood. There was nothing unusual about it. We needed something for a campfire, and the house had exactly what we were looking for. We decided to ask. As I walked toward the front door, I felt as though I was stepping back into the dream. The distance from the road to the house seemed right. The angle of the hill seemed right. Even the position from which I approached the door felt familiar. I could almost predict what would happen next. I raised my hand and knocked. A woman answered the door. We asked whether she had any firewood that we could use for our camp. She pointed toward the wood near the driveway. That was exactly what had happened in the dream. There was no dramatic pause. The woman did not recognize me. She did not say she had been expecting us. She did not mention dreams, the future, or anything unusual. She simply showed us where the firewood was. To everyone else, it was a normal conversation. We had asked for wood. She had agreed to help. We collected it and left. But I was barely thinking about the campfire anymore. I kept looking at the house. The closer I examined it, the more certain I became. It was not only similar to the house in my dream, it seemed to be the same house. The hill behind it had the same appearance. The driveway matched. The firewood was where I remembered it. The action itself had unfolded in the same order. I had arrived at the house. I had knocked. I had asked for campfire wood. Someone had directed us to the driveway. We had taken the wood and left. It was the entire dream, happening in real life. The strangest part was how unimportant the moment was. Nothing dangerous happened. The woman did not reveal a secret. We did not discover anything hidden in the house. There was no accident, emergency, or major decision connected to the event. We were only a group of tired campers looking for firewood. The whole experience lasted a few minutes. Then, we returned to the campsite and continued with the evening. That ordinary nature made it more difficult to understand. People often describe dreams that seem to predict major moments. They dream about a wedding, a death, a disaster, or an important conversation. Those stories at least seem to have a reason for staying in a person's mind. My dream had shown me a completely casual event. I had dreamed about asking a stranger for firewood years before it happened. Why would my mind show me that? Why that house? Why that driveway? Why a small moment in another country? I had no answer. I tried to think of ordinary explanations. Perhaps the house was not as exact as I remembered. Maybe seeing the real place changed my memory of the dream. Human memory is not perfect. When something feels familiar, the mind can reshape old memories to match what is happening in the present. It is possible that the house in my childhood dream had been less detailed than I believed. Perhaps it was only a basic image of a house near a hill. When I saw a similar house in Europe, my mind may have filled in the missing parts and convinced me they were identical. That would be a reasonable explanation. But it did not feel that way. The dream had repeated many times when I was young. I had seen the scene often enough to remember its shape. The house in Europe did not remind me of the dream after the event was over. I began recognizing it while I was approaching. Before we knocked, I already knew the scene. Before the woman pointed toward the driveway, I remembered that this was what would happen. The feeling came before the details were completed. That is why it stayed with me. Another explanation is that I might have seen the house in a photograph without remembering it. Perhaps it appeared in a book, a travel program, an advertisement, or something else during my childhood. My young mind could have stored the image and later used it in a dream. Then, years afterward, I may have visited the real place by coincidence. But that explanation creates more questions. The house was in a remote area. It did not seem famous or important. There was no obvious reason for it to appear in Canadian media or something I had seen as a child. Even if I had somehow seen the house before, that would not explain why my dream included asking for campfire wood from the driveway. It would only explain the appearance of the building. The action still matched. I also considered whether the dream was more common than I thought. Perhaps many children dream about visiting a house and asking for something. Maybe my mind had created a simple scene that could easily happen later in life. A house, a hill, a driveway, and firewood are not impossible details. Given enough time and enough travel, maybe I was eventually going to experience something similar. That explanation is also possible. But the full combination felt too precise. I was from Canada. I had never traveled to Europe. I had the dream when I was about 5. 9 years later, I traveled down a river with a camp group, stopped in a remote area, needed firewood, followed a road, found a house, knocked on the door, asked for wood, and was directed to the driveway. The sequence was exactly what I remembered. The event did not change my life. It did not lead me toward an important decision. I never returned to the house. I did not become friends with the woman who answered the door. As far as I know, nothing else connected to that location ever happened to me. We used the wood for our campfire, finished the trip, and eventually returned home. That should have been the end of it. But I continued thinking about the dream. The experience made me question what dreams really are. Most dreams are probably random mixtures of memory, fear, imagination, and ordinary thoughts. The brain collects pieces from daily life and combines them while we sleep. That explains why dreams often feel familiar even when they make no sense. But sometimes a dream seems to match a future moment too closely. Maybe it is coincidence. Maybe the mind notices only the dreams that later resemble real events and forgets the thousands that do not. I had many dreams as a child. Most of them never happened. Perhaps this one stayed with me only because reality eventually looked similar. That is probably the most logical explanation. Still, I cannot dismiss the feeling I had when I saw that house. It was not a vague thought that I had been there before. It was recognition. I knew the hill. I knew the driveway. I knew where the wood would be. I knew I was supposed to knock and ask for it. The real moment felt less like something new and more like repeating a memory. For a few minutes, I was both 14 years old in Europe and 5 years old inside the dream. The two experiences seemed to overlap. I have tried to remember whether any detail was different. Maybe the color of the house was slightly changed. Maybe the woman at the door did not look exactly like the person in the dream. Maybe the weather was different. There may have been small differences. Dreams are not clear recordings, and childhood memories become weaker over time. But the structure was the same. The house stood in front of the hill. The driveway held the firewood. I approached the door. I knocked. I asked for wood for a campfire. The person who answered directed us toward it. Then, I left. That was the dream. That was also what happened. I sometimes wonder why I stopped having the dream years before the trip. Perhaps my mind no longer needed to show it to me. Perhaps the repetition was only a strange accident of childhood, and the later event was an even stranger coincidence. Or perhaps the dream stopped because the memory had already been placed in my mind, waiting for the day I reached that road. I do not claim to know the answer. I am not saying that I definitely saw the future. I cannot prove that the house was identical to the one in my dream. I have no drawing from when I was 5, no written description, and no one who can confirm every detail. All I have is my memory. That makes the story easy to question. I understand that. If someone else told me the same thing, I might also search for an ordinary explanation. Memory can be unreliable. Coincidences happen. Déjà vu can feel incredibly powerful, but knowing those facts has never fully removed the unease. The moment was too familiar. The dream returned to my mind before the real event had finished unfolding. It felt as though I was watching something I had already seen. The strangest part is that the event itself was so small. There are countless important moments I could have dreamed about. My first trip abroad, the river journey, the people I met, the beginning or end of the camp. Instead, I repeatedly dreamed about one minor task, getting firewood from a stranger's driveway. Maybe that is exactly why the experience feels real to me. A dramatic dream can be created by fear or imagination. A dream about a disaster makes sense because people worry about disasters. A dream about success makes sense because people think about the future. But why would a 5-year-old child in Canada repeatedly dream about walking up to a specific rural house in Europe and asking for campfire wood? I had no reason to imagine that scene. Years later, I lived it. Nothing supernatural happened after that. The house did not disappear. The woman was not a ghost. The firewood was ordinary. We returned to camp and used it. The world continued as normal, but I never forgot the feeling of seeing the hill behind that house and knowing, before I reached the door, that I had already been there. Not physically, not in any way I could explain, only in a dream I had repeated when I was 5 years old. I still have no idea how it happened. Maybe it was coincidence. Maybe my memory connected two similar events and made them seem identical. Maybe I once saw that house somewhere and forgot. Or maybe, for reasons I will never understand, my childhood dreams showed me a completely ordinary moment from my future. A house in another country. A hill behind it. Firewood beside the driveway. A knock on the door. A simple request. Then leaving. Exactly as I had done many times before in my sleep. A few years ago, I went out drinking with a group of friends at a local bar. It was a normal night at first. We had a few drinks, talked, laughed, and took turns doing karaoke. Nothing unusual happened inside the bar, and none of us had any reason to think the night would end differently from any other time we had gone out together. The place stayed busy until closing time. Around 2 in the morning, the staff began turning up the lights, clearing tables, and telling everyone to finish their drinks. My friends had already planned to stay at my apartment that night, so none of us had to worry about driving home. I lived only 4 blocks away. It was a short walk, and we had made similar walks after nights out before. The area was familiar to me. I knew the streets, the buildings, and the quickest route back to my place. We left the bar together. The streets were much quieter than they had been earlier in the evening. Most businesses were closed, and only a few lights remained on inside nearby buildings. The air felt cooler after spending hours in the crowded bar. My friends and I were still talking and laughing as we walked. I do not remember the exact conversation. It was probably nothing important. We were tired and had been drinking, so the discussion likely moved from one subject to another without making much sense. I was walking with the group one moment. Then, without any warning, I was completely alone. There was no gradual change. I did not notice my friends walking ahead or falling behind. I did not turn down a different street by mistake. I did not stop to tie my shoe or look at my phone. 1 second, they were around me. The next, they were gone. At first, I thought I had simply become distracted and lost sight of them. Maybe they had crossed the street or continued around a corner while I was looking somewhere else. Then a bright light appeared directly above me. It was so sudden that I froze. The light formed a perfect circle around me, like a powerful spotlight. It seemed to come from somewhere high above, although I could not see the source. My first thought was that it had to be the police. Perhaps a police car had stopped nearby. Maybe an officer had seen a group of people leaving a bar and wanted to check what we were doing. For a second, I expected to hear someone telling me to stop or put my hands where they could see them. But there was no voice. There was no siren. I could not hear a car engine. The light continued to shine down on me. Then it began growing brighter. It did not simply stay at the same level. The intensity kept increasing, as though someone were slowly turning up the power. I raised my arms to protect my eyes, but it did not help much. The light surrounded me and reflected from everything nearby. The street, the pavement, and the buildings became difficult to see. I looked around for my friends. They were nowhere. I called out, but I do not remember hearing an answer. The light became so intense that the rest of the world seemed to disappear. There was only the brightness and the feeling that I was standing alone beneath it. I could no longer see where the street ended. I could not see the nearby buildings clearly. I could not see anyone watching me. I remember feeling confused more than frightened at first. My mind kept trying to find a normal explanation. Maybe it was a helicopter. Maybe it was some kind of security light. Maybe my eyes were reacting badly because I had been drinking. None of those explanations felt right. A helicopter would have made noise. A normal light would not have appeared so suddenly or grown so bright. The streets around me had been familiar only moments earlier, but under that light, I no longer felt like I knew where I was. That is the last clear memory I have of standing on the street. I do not know what happened next. There is simply a blank space. I cannot remember falling down. I cannot remember anyone approaching me. I cannot remember being taken anywhere. There are no broken images, sounds, or half memories that I can put together. One moment, I was standing beneath that growing light. The next thing I remember is opening my eyes somewhere completely different. I was lying flat on my back. The surface beneath me felt cold and hard. For a few seconds, I did not understand where I was. The sky above me was beginning to brighten. The sun had not fully risen, but the darkness of the night was fading. The sky had that pale, early morning color that appears shortly before sunrise. I slowly moved my head and tried to understand my surroundings. That was when I realized I was lying on the outdoor awning connected to my apartment building. At the time, I lived on the 4th floor. The awning was not a normal balcony where people could sit outside. It was a roof-like structure below part of my apartment. There was no staircase or ladder leading to it from the ground. A person could not easily climb onto it from the outside. The only possible way I knew to reach it was by going through my apartment. Even then, it was not somewhere anyone would normally choose to lie down. Getting onto it required passing through the apartment and reaching the correct opening. I had no memory of entering the building. I did not remember walking up the stairs. I did not remember unlocking my apartment door. I did not remember climbing out onto the awning. I did not even know whether I still had my keys with me at that moment. I was simply there, lying on my back as the sun began to rise. My body felt heavy and disoriented. I had the kind of confusion that happens when you wake suddenly in an unfamiliar place, except the place was connected to my own home. I wondered whether I had somehow climbed out there while drunk. That explanation did not make sense. Even if I had been extremely intoxicated, I would first have needed to return to the apartment. I would have needed to enter the building, unlock the door, and reach the awning without falling or injuring myself. I remembered none of it. As I lay there trying to think, I noticed lights to my left. They were blinking in the sky. At first, I thought I was seeing an aeroplane. Then, I looked more carefully. The lights were arranged in what appeared to be a disc shape. I could not see every detail of the object. The sky was still dim, and the lights were much clearer than the body around them. But they did not look like the normal red and green lights of an aeroplane. They formed a circular pattern. I stayed still and watched. My fear returned immediately. I slowly pushed myself up onto my elbows, trying not to make any sudden movement. The object remained in the sky. Then it began moving in a circle. It was a smooth, controlled motion, unlike any aircraft movement I had seen before. It seemed to turn through the air without banking in the way a plane would. After completing the circular movement, it suddenly shot upward. There was no slow climb. There was no gradual increase in speed. 1 second, the blinking lights were visible. The next, they moved straight up at an impossible speed and disappeared into the atmosphere. I sat there, staring at the empty sky. There was no sound, no engine noise, no trail. Nothing remained to prove the lights had ever been there. I did not know whether I had truly seen an object or whether my mind was still confused from whatever had happened during the missing time. But the image was clear. A disc-shaped arrangement of blinking lights had moved in a circle and then flown upward faster than anything I had ever seen. I stayed on the awning for another moment, trying to calm myself. My heart was beating hard, and my hands were shaking. I wanted to get inside. I carefully made my way back into the apartment. My friends were already there. They had apparently continued home after we became separated. They were planning to sleep at my place, as we had discussed earlier. Seeing them should have made me feel safer, but I was also angry and confused. I asked them what had happened. I told them I remembered walking with them after leaving the bar. Then they had suddenly vanished, and I had found myself standing alone beneath a bright light. I explained that I had later woken on the awning and seen strange lights in the sky. They looked at me as though they did not understand what I was talking about. Then they told me their version of what had happened. According to them, I had been walking normally with the group. Then my eyes changed. They said my eyes turned completely white. I asked what they meant, but they could not explain it any better. They claimed the visible parts of my eyes seemed white, as though my pupils and irises were gone. They also said I began speaking in a strange way. They could hear my voice, but they did not recognize the way I was talking. They could not understand what I was saying, and it did not sound like my normal speech. Then, without warning, I ran away from them. They said I headed toward the tree line. That detail frightened me. There was no reason for me to run toward the trees. My apartment was in a different direction, and I knew the area well enough not to become confused about the route home. I asked whether they had followed me. They said they had not. They assumed I was being drunk and belligerent. Because we had all been drinking, they apparently decided I was acting foolishly and would eventually make my way home on my own. So they continued to my apartment without me. I could not understand how they had entered if I was not there, although I may have given them access earlier, or someone may already have had a key. That part of the night is not clear in my memory now. What I remember clearly is how disturbed I felt by their explanation. From my point of view, they had disappeared. From their point of view, I had changed, spoken strangely, and run toward the trees. Neither version explained how I ended up on the 4th floor awning. I asked them what time they had arrived. I tried to work out how much time was missing, but nobody had been watching the clock carefully. We had left the bar around 2 in the morning, and the sun was beginning to rise when I woke. That meant several hours may have passed. I had no idea where I had been during that time. I checked myself for injuries. My clothes were still on. I did not remember being attacked. I did not feel seriously hurt. although I was tired and confused. There were no obvious cuts on my hands or face. My shoes were still with me. If I had been running through the trees, I expected to find mud, scratches, or torn clothing, but I do not remember noticing anything severe. My friends treated the whole thing as though it had been strange, but probably caused by alcohol. I wanted to believe that. I had been drinking. People sometimes black out and do things they cannot remember. A person can walk, speak, argue, and even appear awake during an alcohol blackout, then have no memory of it later. That could explain the missing time. It could explain why I ran. It might even explain why my friends said I spoke strangely. But it did not explain the white eyes. It did not explain the spotlight. It did not explain the disc-shaped lights. And it did not explain how I reached the awning. I tried to push the experience aside. I told myself I had probably dreamed part of it. Perhaps I had returned home, climbed onto the awning for some drunken reason, fallen asleep, and imagined the object while waking. That explanation was uncomfortable, but it was better than the alternatives. Later that day, I took a shower. By then, I was still thinking about the night, but I had begun feeling more normal. The sunlight and the ordinary sounds of the day made everything seem less frightening. While washing, I noticed something on my upper arm. There was a small slit in my bicep. It looked like a clean cut in the skin. I did not remember injuring myself. I touched the area carefully and felt a lump beneath the skin. It seemed as though there was something inside my arm. The lump was not simply normal muscle. I could feel a distinct shape under the area where the slit appeared. My first thought was that it might be a spider bite. Maybe an insect had bitten me during the night. Perhaps I had fallen against something while running through the trees. The slit might have been a scratch, and the lump could have been swelling. That was the most normal explanation I could find. Still, after everything else that had happened, the mark frightened me. The cut and the lump seemed too closely connected to the missing time. I decided to see a doctor. I did not want to wait and discover that the area had become infected, or that something was seriously wrong. When I arrived, I explained that I had noticed a cut and a lump inside my arm. The doctor came in and examined the area. I looked down to show exactly where it had been. There was nothing there. The slit had disappeared. The skin was smooth. There was no fresh cut, scab, redness, or sign that the wound had healed recently. I pressed my fingers into my bicep, trying to find the lump. It was gone. I moved my hand around the entire area. Nothing. The doctor could not see or feel anything unusual. From their point of view, I had come in worried about a mark that did not exist. I knew what I had seen in the shower. I had felt the opening in the skin. I had pressed the lump beneath it. It had been real enough to make me seek medical help. But by the time I was examined, it had vanished completely. A normal cut does not fully heal in such a short time. A lump beneath the skin does not usually disappear within hours without leaving tenderness or swelling. Yet there was no evidence that either had ever been there. That frightened me more than the lights. At least the object in the sky could have been a dream, a distant aircraft, or confusion caused by alcohol. The mark was physical. I had seen it while fully awake in the shower. I had touched it. Then, it was gone. After that day, I began replaying the entire night repeatedly. I thought about leaving the bar. I thought about the moment my friends disappeared. I remembered the spotlight growing brighter and brighter. I tried to force myself to remember what came after, but the blank space remained. No matter how hard I concentrated, nothing returned. Then, I would picture waking on the awning. I would see the pale sky and the blinking lights to my left. I would remember the object moving in a circle and shooting upward. Then I would remember what my friends had said. My eyes had turned white. I had spoken in an unfamiliar way. I had run toward the tree line. I do not know how much of their account was accurate. They had been drinking, too. Their memories may not have been reliable. Perhaps the streetlights made my eyes appear strange. Maybe I was mumbling or speaking nonsense, and they later remembered it as something more disturbing. It is also possible they were joking with me. But their story matched the period I could not remember. They watched me run away. I experienced the sudden light. Then several hours disappeared. I also still do not understand why they did not follow me. If someone's eyes appeared completely white and they began speaking in an unknown voice, I would hope their friends would not simply let them run into the darkness. Maybe the situation looked less serious to them at the time. Maybe they believed I was only drunk. Maybe they thought I would return within a few minutes. Whatever the reason, I was alone after that. Sometimes I try to build a normal version of the night. In that version, I drank too much and experienced an alcohol blackout. I became confused, ran away from my friends, and later returned to my apartment. I somehow climbed onto the awning and fell asleep. As I woke, I saw a plane or helicopter and misinterpreted its lights. The slit and lump on my arm were temporary swelling or a trick of the light in the shower. By the time I saw the doctor, the swelling had gone down. That explanation is possible. It is the one I prefer. But it requires several unlikely events to happen together. It requires me to reach a difficult location with no memory. It requires the object to move in a way I have never seen an aircraft move. It requires my friends to imagine the same strange change in my behavior. It requires a visible cut and a solid lump to disappear in a very short time. The other explanation is something I do not like thinking about. Maybe the light was not from the police. Maybe the missing time was not caused only by alcohol. Maybe the object I saw was connected to whatever happened during those hours. I have no proof. There are no photographs. The doctor found nothing. My friends did not see the lights. No one else came forward to report an object above the building. All I have are memories, a missing period of time, and the stories my friends told me the next morning. I know how unbelievable it sounds. Had someone told me this story before it happened to me, I probably would have assumed they drank too much and became confused. That may still be the answer. But I know what the spotlight felt like. I know how completely the world disappeared around me. I know where I woke. I know there was no normal outside access to that awning. I know what I saw moving in the sky. And I know that there had been a slit in my arm with a lump beneath it before both vanished. Years have passed since that night. Nothing similar has happened again. I have not seen another disc-shaped object. I have not experienced another period of missing time. I have not found another unexplained mark on my body. Most days, I do not think about it. Then, something brings the memory back. A bright light shining through a window. A story about someone losing several hours. A strange aircraft moving at night. When that happens, I feel the same chill. I return to that empty street. My friends are suddenly gone. The light is above me. It becomes brighter until there is nothing else. Then the memory stops. The next thing I know, I am lying on my back, 4 floors above the ground, watching blinking lights circle in the early morning sky before shooting upward and disappearing. I still do not know what happened during the hours between those 2 moments. I do not know how I reached the awning. I do not know why my friends saw my eyes turn white. I do not know what language or voice they heard me using. I do not know what caused the cut and the lump inside my arm. Perhaps the entire event has an ordinary explanation. I hope it does. But even now, Whenever I think about the missing time and what may have happened inside it, I get chills.
Quick pause, then we're right back. A lot of people watch one story and leave, but some stick around. They hit subscribe and come back every night. If you want to be one of them, the button's right there. Turn on the bell too, so you never miss a new one. That's it. Let's get back to the story.
When I was around 10 or 11 years old, my whole family traveled to my great-grandparents' hometown for a holiday. It was not a small village or an isolated rural area. It was one of the biggest cities in the country, possibly the second largest, and it was quite modern. There were busy streets, shops, apartment buildings, traffic, and plenty of people around. Because of that, I never expected anything strange to happen there. When people tell stories about ghosts or unexplained encounters, they often describe old villages, dark forests, or abandoned places far from civilization. This city did not feel like that at all. It felt normal, crowded, and safe. My great-grandparents still had a house there, and that was where the family stayed during the trip. There were many of us. My parents, aunts, uncles, cousins, and other extended family members had all come along. The house was busy from morning until night. Someone was always talking, preparing food, moving through the rooms, or planning where we would go next. For most of the holiday, everything was completely ordinary. We spent our days sightseeing around the city. We visited busy areas, walked through markets, saw local landmarks, and spent hours moving from one place to another. By the end of each day, everyone was usually exhausted. One evening, after a full day of sightseeing, a large group of us began walking back to my great-grandparents' house. There were around 12 or 13 people in the group. Because there were so many of us, I felt completely safe. I was surrounded by adults and relatives. People were talking, laughing, and discussing the places we had visited during the day. It was already dark, but the streets were not frightening. There were houses and buildings around us, and I knew we were getting close to where we were staying. I was tired and probably not paying close attention to the route. I simply followed the group as we moved through the neighborhood. Then I noticed a little girl behind us. I do not remember exactly when she appeared. One moment, I was walking with my family. The next, I became aware of a young girl following a short distance away. She looked completely normal. There was nothing obviously frightening about her appearance. She did not look injured, dirty, or unnatural. She looked like an ordinary child, probably close to my age or slightly younger. Because she seemed so normal, I did not feel afraid. My first thought was that she might be lost. It was late, and she appeared to be alone. I wondered why no adult was walking with her. I thought she might be trying to follow us because she needed help. I kept looking back at her. She did not call out. She did not run toward us. She simply continued behind the group. I do not know whether anyone else noticed her. The adults were still talking, and the rest of the children were probably tired and distracted. Nobody reacted to the girl or asked who she was. I began to slow down. I wanted to speak to her and ask whether she was lost. What happened next has always bothered me because I do not clearly remember deciding to leave the group. I did not tell my parents that I had seen someone. I did not call to my aunt or uncle. I did not ask one of the adults to come with me. I simply separated from everyone and started moving toward the girl. At the time, it felt natural. I saw a child who might need help, so I went to speak to her. Looking back, it was a strange thing to do. I was 10 or 11 years old in a city I did not know well. It was dark, and I was surrounded by family. Normally, I would have told an adult before going anywhere. Instead, I walked away from the group without saying anything. The girl remained ahead of me. I tried to get closer. I do not remember her making any sign that she wanted me to follow. She did not wave or call my name. She did not speak at all. Still, I felt drawn toward her. The voices of my family seemed farther away as I continued walking. I was focused entirely on the girl. Before I could reach her, someone suddenly grabbed me from behind. The force of it frightened me. My aunt and uncle had come after me and pulled me backward. They told me I was going the wrong way. At first, I did not understand what they meant. I believed I had only moved a short distance from the group. I thought the girl was right in front of me and that I could speak to her quickly before returning. But my aunt and uncle seemed alarmed. They pulled me back toward the others and told me not to wander away. I looked for the little girl again. I cannot remember clearly whether she disappeared at that exact moment or whether I simply lost sight of her while my relatives were speaking to me. What I do remember is that I did not get to talk to her. My aunt and uncle returned me to the group, and we continued walking to my great-grandparents' house. At the time, I was more confused than frightened. I thought my aunt and uncle had misunderstood what I was doing. I believed I had only been trying to help a lost child. When we reached the house, I told my parents what had happened. I explained that I had seen a little girl following us. I told them she appeared to be alone and that I had tried to speak to her. My parents did not seem concerned. They said I must have imagined it. Maybe I had seen another child walking near the group. Maybe I was tired after the long day. Maybe the girl had been standing near one of the houses, and I mistakenly believed she was following us. There were many normal explanations, and my parents did not want me to worry. They probably assumed I had created the story because I was young and exhausted. After that conversation, the holiday continued as usual. Nothing else strange happened for the next few days. We went sightseeing, ate meals with the family, and spent time together at the house. The little girl was not mentioned again. I did not see her during the day. I did not dream about her. I slowly stopped thinking about the encounter. Eventually, it was time for us to return home. Our flight was very early in the morning, so we had to leave my great-grandparents' house at around 4 o'clock. The entire family was tired. The city was much quieter at that hour. Most people were asleep, and the streets did not have the same energy they had during the day. The darkness before sunrise feels different from normal nighttime darkness. At midnight, there are still people awake. Cars move through the streets, restaurants close, and lights remain on inside houses. At 4 in the morning, everything feels still. We carried our bags outside and prepared to leave for the airport. My grandfather's car was waiting. I got inside, probably still half asleep, and settled into my seat. The adults finished loading the luggage, checked that everyone had their documents, and made sure nothing had been left behind. As the car prepared to leave, I looked out of the window. That was when I saw the little girl again. She was standing outside near the house. This time, she was not alone. A tall man stood beside her, holding her hand. Neither of them moved. They did not wave. They did not walk toward the car. They simply stood there and watched. I stared back at them. The little girl looked like the same child I had seen following us days earlier. I recognized her immediately, even though I had only seen her briefly that night. The man beside her was much taller. I do not remember his face clearly. What stayed with me was his height and the way he held the girl's hand. They seemed completely still. There was something unnatural about how they stood there together in the darkness. If they had been normal people from the neighborhood, I would have expected them to move, speak, or react to a car leaving at 4 in the morning. But they did nothing. They only watched. I did not say anything to my family. I do not know why. Perhaps I was afraid my parents would tell me I was imagining things again. Maybe I was still too tired to understand what I was seeing. Or perhaps something about the two figures made me feel that I should remain quiet. The car started moving. I continued staring through the window as we pulled away from the house. The little girl and the tall man did not move an inch. They remained in the same position, holding hands and watching us leave. I kept looking back until the house and the figures disappeared from view. The rest of the journey to the airport was normal. Nobody mentioned seeing a girl or a man outside. No one asked who they were. As far as I knew, I was the only person in the car who noticed them. After we returned home, life continued. The trip became a family memory, and the strange encounter slowly became something I did not think about often. As the years passed, I began to question my own memory. I had been a child. Maybe I really had imagined the girl. Maybe the figures at 4 in the morning were neighbors, shadows, or objects that looked human in the darkness. Perhaps I had connected two unrelated moments and created a stranger story in my mind. Those explanations were easier to accept. For a long time, I did not discuss it with anyone. Then, years later, the aunt who had pulled me back that night came to visit us in Europe. By that time, I was older and able to describe the memory more clearly. We were talking about the family holiday, and I decided to ask whether she remembered the night I wandered away from the group. At first, she said she did not remember much. It had happened years earlier, and to her, it may have been only a brief moment during a busy family trip. Then she began remembering certain details. She said she clearly remembered seeing me leave the group. According to her, I had not simply moved a few steps to the side. I was walking in the direction of an abandoned house. That detail shocked me. I had never known there was an abandoned house nearby. In my memory, I had only been following a little girl who appeared to be lost. My aunt said I was already very close to the fence around the property. Her brother, my uncle, had noticed where I was going and told her to help him bring me back. The two of them hurried after me and pulled me away before I reached the fence. I asked whether she had seen the little girl. She said she had not. As far as she remembered, I was walking alone toward the abandoned house. That made the memory much more frightening. I had always assumed my aunt and uncle stopped me because I was leaving the group or taking the wrong street. I had not realized I was approaching an abandoned property. I had been following the girl directly toward it. I told my aunt everything I remembered. I described seeing the child behind the group. I explained that I thought she was lost and wanted to speak to her. Then I told her about the morning we left for the airport. I said I had seen the same girl standing outside with a tall man holding her hand. My aunt became uncomfortable. She had never heard that part of the story. For a moment, she seemed genuinely disturbed. She asked questions about what they looked like and where they had been standing. I told her that they did not move and that they watched the car leave. My aunt eventually dismissed it. She said I probably had an overactive imagination. That was the same explanation my parents had given years earlier. Maybe they were right. Children often see patterns in darkness. They can misunderstand distances, shadows, and ordinary people. A tired child can imagine that a stranger is following a group. A fence, tree, or object near a house can appear human in weak light. Memory can also change over time. The more often a person thinks about an old event, the more the mind fills in missing details. I understand all of that, but my aunt's memory confirmed an important part. I had walked away from the group. I had been heading toward an abandoned house. I had reached the fence before my aunt and uncle stopped me. That was not something I invented years later. They had seen it happen. The question was, why? Why would I leave a large group of relatives at night and walk toward an abandoned property? Why did I believe I was following a little girl? Why did she appear again on the morning we left? And who was the tall man holding her hand? I have tried to imagine normal possibilities. Maybe a real child lived nearby and walked toward the abandoned house for some reason. Perhaps the property was not completely empty, even if the family believed it was abandoned. Maybe people used the yard as a shortcut. Maybe the girl had a parent or relative nearby, and the man I saw later was that person. But if she was real, why did nobody else see her? Why did she not answer when I approached? Why did my aunt remember me walking alone? Another possibility is that I saw someone near the property and became confused about where she was going. I may have thought she was following us when she was actually walking home. Then, because I was tired, I wandered toward the wrong house while trying to find her. The figures at 4 a.m. may have been completely different people. That explanation is possible. But the little girl looked the same to me. I recognized her immediately. It felt as though she had returned to watch us leave. The tall man made the scene even more disturbing. I sometimes wonder whether he had been inside the abandoned house the entire time. Perhaps the girl had been leading me toward him. I do not like that possibility, but it is difficult not to think about it. The danger may not have been supernatural. A child walking alone toward an abandoned house at night could have encountered a real person hiding there. The little girl might have been used to attract attention. The tall man could have been waiting. If my aunt and uncle had not noticed me leaving the group, I might have reached the fence. I might have entered the property. I might have disappeared from view before anyone realized where I had gone. That possibility frightens me more than the idea of ghosts, but it does not fully explain what I saw at 4 a.m. If the girl and man were real people, why were they standing outside my great-grandparents' house? Why were they awake and waiting before sunrise? Why did they remain completely still as we drove away? They had no reason to know we were leaving for the airport. Unless they had been watching the house. The other explanation is that the girl was connected to the abandoned property in some way. Maybe she had once lived there. Maybe the tall man had as well. Perhaps I saw something that the adults could not see. I do not know whether I believe that. I did not hear any story about a tragedy connected to the house. Nobody told me that a child or man had died there. I never researched the property, and I do not even know whether it still exists. All I have is the memory. A little girl followed our family through the dark streets. I left the group to approach her. My aunt and uncle pulled me back just before I reached the fence of an abandoned house. Days later, at 4 a.m, the same girl stood outside with a tall man holding her hand. They watched us leave without moving. Years afterward, my aunt confirmed that there had been no visible girl. She only saw me walking alone toward the abandoned property. The story still bothers me because I cannot tell whether I was being drawn toward something or simply imagining it. At 10 or 11 years old, I had no reason to walk toward that house. I did not know it was abandoned. I was not exploring or trying to frighten myself. I believed I was helping a lost child. That belief was strong enough to make me separate from 12 or 13 family members without saying a word. I often wonder what would have happened if my uncle had not noticed. My aunt said I was already close to the fence. Another few seconds might have been enough for me to reach the property. Would the girl have waited for me? Would she have disappeared? Would I have found the tall man? Or would there have been nothing there at all? I will never know. My aunt and uncle pulled me back before I could reach the house. My parents dismissed the girl as imagination. The holiday continued. Then the girl appeared one final time, standing beside a man in the darkness before sunrise. I never saw either of them again. Even now, I can picture them as the car pulled away. the small girl holding the hand of the tall man. Both of them completely still, both of them watching. And somewhere nearby, the abandoned house I had almost followed her into. My youngest was 2, and my oldest was 4. They both had the kind of bedtime routine most parents know well. There were drinks of water, blankets to fix, stuffed animals to arrange, and the usual last-minute reasons why they could not possibly sleep yet. Eventually, they settled down. Their bedroom was upstairs, across the hallway from mine. I stayed downstairs for the rest of the evening, cleaning a few things, watching television, and enjoying the rare quiet that comes after young children finally fall asleep. By around 10 o'clock, the house was completely still. My children were usually good sleepers. Once they had been asleep for a few hours, they rarely woke up. They might move around, mumble, or kick off a blanket, but they normally stayed in bed until morning. I decided to go outside for a cigarette. Whenever I did that at night, I sometimes opened the back door for a moment and listened before stepping farther away from the house. It had become a small habit. I would stand quietly and check whether I could hear crying, footsteps, or one of the children calling for me. That night, I did not bother. I remember thinking, they always sleep well at this time. There is no chance either of them is awake. It was one of those small decisions that means nothing at the time, but feels important afterward. I stepped outside and closed the door behind me. The night was quiet. I smoked for a few minutes and thought about nothing important. I was tired, and I was probably looking forward to going back inside and getting ready for bed. Everything felt normal. When I finished the cigarette, I opened the door and walked back into the house. The moment I stepped inside, I heard footsteps upstairs. They were quick. It sounded exactly like someone running down the hallway and back into the children's room. I stopped near the door and listened. The footsteps ended suddenly. At first, I was not scared. I was annoyed. I thought one of the children had woken up, left the bedroom, and then heard me coming back into the house. My oldest had started doing things like that. She would get out of bed, wander around, and then rush back under the covers if she thought she was about to be caught. Oh, great, I thought. The one time I do not listen at the door is the one time one of them wakes up. I locked the door behind me and started walking toward the stairs. The downstairs lights were mostly off. I had left the light near the staircase on, but the rest of the house was dim because I did not want to wake the children. I climbed slowly, trying not to make too much noise. If one of them was awake, I did not want to frighten them. I planned to guide them back into bed, fix the blankets, and leave without making a big issue out of it. As I reached the upper hallway, I gently called out, "Who's awake?" There was no answer. I continued toward their room. The bedroom door was almost closed, but not completely. A narrow strip of darkness showed through the opening. I pushed the door slightly and looked inside. That was when I heard them. Both of my children were snoring. Not pretending to snore, not breathing loudly, because they knew I was standing at the door. They were completely asleep. My youngest was lying in the position I had left him in. My oldest was also still under her blankets. I stood there and watched them, carefully. My oldest had tried to fake sleep before. She thought she was good at it, but like most 4-year-olds, she was not very convincing. When she pretended to sleep, her body became too stiff. Her breathing sounded forced, and she would sometimes squeeze her eyes shut too tightly. If I waited long enough, she usually smiled or moved because she knew I was watching. This was different. Her face was relaxed. Her breathing was deep and steady. My youngest was in an even deeper sleep. He made the same soft snoring sound he often made at night, completely unaware that I had entered the room. Neither of them could have been running through the hallway seconds earlier. I knew that immediately. There was no doubt in my mind. The footsteps I heard had not come from my children. That realization hit me all at once. The hairs on my arms rose, and a cold feeling moved through my body. I looked back into the hallway. It was empty. The staircase light cast a weak glow across part of the floor, but the rooms farther down the hall remained dark. I listened for movement. Nothing. For a few seconds, I tried to find a normal explanation. Maybe I had heard something outside. Maybe an animal had moved across the roof. Maybe the sound had traveled strangely through the house. But I knew what footsteps sounded like. I had 2 small children. I heard them running through the house every day. The noise had been clear. Someone had moved quickly upstairs and gone into their bedroom. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone. I turned on the flashlight. The narrow beam moved across the hallway, the walls, and the bedroom door. I did not switch on the main lights because I still did not want to wake or scare the children. At that moment, I was not sure whether I had heard an intruder or something else, but my first concern was keeping them calm. My bedroom was directly across from theirs. I quietly crossed the hallway and went inside. I kept the flashlight pointed ahead of me and listened for any sound behind the furniture or near the closet. My room appeared empty. I went to the place where I kept a hunting knife and picked it up. I am not saying carrying the knife made me feel brave. It did not. It only made me feel slightly less helpless. If someone had entered the house and gone upstairs, I needed something to defend my children and myself. I held the knife firmly and returned to the hallway. My heart had started beating faster. I checked the staircase first. Nobody was coming up. Then I began searching the rooms upstairs. I moved slowly, keeping the phone flashlight in front of me. I checked behind doors. I checked closets. I looked under beds. I searched the bathroom, pulling back the shower curtain, even though I knew it had been closed earlier. Every small sound made me stop. The house seemed different now. Places I walked through every day suddenly looked unfamiliar in the weak phone light. Shadows formed behind furniture, and every dark corner seemed large enough to hide a person. I kept listening for breathing or movement. There was nothing. I checked one room, then another. No open windows, no damaged locks, no one crouching behind furniture, no stranger hiding in a closet. With every empty room, I should have felt safer. Instead, I became more afraid. If no one was in the other rooms, there was only one place left: the children's bedroom. I had looked through the doorway and confirmed that both children were asleep, but I had not searched the room carefully. I had not checked behind the rocking chair. I had not looked under the beds. I had not opened the closet. I had not looked behind the large stuffed animals in the corner. That was when I remembered the exact direction of the footsteps. They had run into the children's room. The thought that someone might be hiding in there, only a few feet from my sleeping children, caused a level of panic I had never experienced before. My stomach seemed to drop. My grip tightened around the knife. I stood in the hallway, staring at the partly closed door. For one terrible moment, I imagined a person crouching somewhere inside. Maybe they were waiting for me to leave. Maybe they had watched me look through the doorway. Maybe they were hidden behind the rocking chair, close enough to reach the children before I could stop them. Every possible situation went through my mind. I thought about running into the room, grabbing both children and carrying them downstairs, but I could not safely carry a 2-year-old and a 4-year-old while holding a knife and a phone. If someone was hiding in the room, turning my back to them could be the worst thing I could do. I considered calling the police immediately. But if there was an intruder within reach of my children, I did not know how long I could wait. There was no perfect choice. There was only the door. I pointed the flashlight toward it and slowly moved forward. My whole body felt tense. I tried to stay quiet, but my breathing sounded loud in my ears. The children were still snoring inside. Then I heard music. It was soft and low. Twinkle, twinkle, little star. The song was coming from the children's nightlight. The nightlight sometimes played lullabies, so the music itself was not unusual, but in that moment it sounded terrifying. The slow little tune filled the dark room while I stood in the hallway holding a knife, convinced someone might be hiding beside my sleeping children. It felt like a scene from a horror movie. The bedroom door moved slightly when I touched it. It creaked as I pushed it open. The lullaby continued playing. I stepped inside. The phone flashlight moved across the nearest bed. My youngest was still asleep. Then the light moved to my oldest. She had not changed position. Neither child reacted to the door opening or the light crossing the room. I looked toward the corner. There was a rocking chair near the wall. Behind it were several large stuffed animals. The chair was moving, only slightly. It rocked forward, then backward. The movement was slow enough that I might not have noticed it on any normal night. But nothing about that moment felt normal. I stared at the chair. Someone could have been crouching behind it. The stuffed animals were large enough to hide part of a body. The rocking chair and the shadows made it impossible to see the entire corner from where I stood. My mind immediately formed an image of someone pressed against the wall, waiting for me to come closer. I told myself the chair might have been moving because of air. Maybe the heating system had turned on. Maybe I had disturbed it when I opened the door. Maybe one of the children had touched it earlier, and it had continued moving. None of those explanations felt convincing. I had never noticed the chair moving by itself before. The lullaby kept playing. I wanted to leave. Every part of me wanted to back out of the room, take the children, and run. But the thought of leaving any part of the room unchecked was worse. I moved closer to the rocking chair. The knife was raised in front of me. I directed the flashlight behind it. At first, all I could see were the stuffed animals. A large bear. Another soft toy pushed against the wall. Dark spaces between them. I used the knife hand to move the chair aside. It scraped softly against the floor. Nothing jumped out. I moved one of the stuffed animals. There was nobody behind it. I checked the entire corner. Empty, I searched under the rocking chair. Nothing. The fear did not disappear. Now I had to check the rest of the room. I looked under the first bed. There were toys, a small box, and shadows, but no person. I looked under the second bed. Nothing. I checked the closet. Clothes hung normally. Shoes and other items were on the floor. No one was hiding behind them. I checked behind the curtains. The windows were closed. I moved around the room slowly, examining every place large enough for someone to hide. There was nothing. The children remained asleep through all of it. That almost made the situation more disturbing. I was moving furniture, opening the closet, shining a flashlight across the walls, and breathing as though I had just been running. Neither child woke. They seemed far too deeply asleep to have left the room moments earlier. After checking the bedroom, I searched the whole upstairs again. This time, I was more aggressive. I opened every closet fully. I checked behind furniture a second time. I looked in spaces I knew were too small to hide an adult. I went downstairs and searched the rest of the house. I checked the kitchen, the living room, and every entrance. I checked the windows. Nothing appeared broken or open. There was no sign that anyone had entered. I looked behind curtains and inside cupboards. I even checked places that made no logical sense because I was too frightened to leave anything unexplored. Then I went through the house again. Still nothing. No intruder, no open door, no missing item, no muddy footprint, no explanation for the footsteps. Eventually, I returned upstairs. The children were still sleeping in their room. The rocking chair had stopped moving. The lullaby from the nightlight had either ended or switched off. The room looked ordinary again. That should have made me feel relieved, but I could not relax. I knew what I had heard when I entered the house. Those were not random creaks. The sound had been fast, clear, and deliberate. It was the sound of feet running away from me, and it had ended inside the children's room. I woke both children. They were confused and sleepy. Neither of them seemed frightened. Neither said they had been awake or walking around. My oldest did not understand why I was asking questions. My youngest was too young to explain anything clearly. I carried them into my bedroom. That night, all three of us slept in the same bed. I locked the bedroom door. I kept the knife nearby and my phone within reach. I do not think I slept much. Every time the house made a sound, I opened my eyes. I listened for footsteps in the hallway. I expected someone to try the door handle or move outside the room. Nothing happened. Morning came normally. Sunlight filled the hallway, and the house looked exactly as it always had. I searched again during the day. In daylight, the room seemed smaller and less threatening. I checked the locks, windows, closets, and the area around the rocking chair. I looked for scratches, footprints, or anything that could show someone had been inside. There was nothing. I considered whether one of the children might have been sleepwalking. A child can move around while still mostly asleep and then return to bed without remembering. But I had heard the footsteps only seconds before reaching the top of the stairs. Both children were lying comfortably under their blankets. Their breathing was deep and steady. Neither looked as if they had just run down a hallway and climbed back into bed. My oldest might have tried to fake sleep, but my youngest could not have done it so convincingly. Both of them appeared completely unconscious. I also considered whether an animal might have entered the house. A cat or another small animal could make quick sounds on a wooden floor. But I found no animal. The footsteps had also sounded too heavy and too evenly spaced. They sounded human. I wondered whether the sound came from the heating system or pipes. Old houses can create strange noises when temperatures change. Wood expands, walls settle, and pipes knock. But those sounds do not usually travel like running feet. The noise had started near the stairs and moved quickly toward the bedroom. It had direction. It sounded as if something had heard me entering and wanted to hide. That was the part I could not forget. Maybe my fear changed the memory. Maybe I heard an ordinary house noise and interpreted it as footsteps because I expected one of the children to be awake. Then, after seeing them asleep, my mind turned the moment into something more frightening. I understand that possibility. The brain tries to make patterns from sounds, especially at night. But I had not been afraid when I heard the footsteps. My immediate reaction was irritation. I was certain one of the children had run back to bed. The fear only began after I saw both of them sleeping. I have replayed the sequence many times. I came inside. I heard running. I went upstairs. I called out. Both children were deeply asleep. I searched the house. The rocking chair moved. Nothing was found. There is no dramatic ending. I did not discover a stranger in the closet. The police did not find signs of a break-in. No hidden person later appeared. I never learned what caused the sound. That uncertainty is what stayed with me. Had I found an open window, I could have blamed the wind. Had one child admitted getting out of bed, I could have accepted sleepwalking. Had I found an animal hiding downstairs, I would have had an explanation. Instead, the house gave me nothing. I only know that I heard someone run into my children's room. When I entered, both children were asleep. The room was dark. A lullaby played from the nightlight. The rocking chair moved gently in the corner. And for several minutes, I had to search every inch of that room while wondering whether someone was hiding only a few feet from my children. I have never felt fear like that before or since. Fear for yourself is one thing. Fear that something may be close to your children is completely different. It forces you to move even when every part of your body wants to run. That night, I went behind the chair because I had no choice. I looked under the beds because I had no choice. I opened the closet because I had no choice. There was nothing there. At least, nothing I could see. The children were safe. We stayed together behind a locked door until morning. But I still do not know whose footsteps I heard running upstairs. And I still do not know why they stopped in the children's room. I was probably 7 or 8 years old when I woke up in the middle of the night and saw a man standing outside my bedroom window, staring directly at me. I may have been even younger. I cannot remember my exact age, but I remember the room, the darkness, and the fear so clearly that the image has stayed with me for most of my life. It was very late. I would guess somewhere between 1 and 3 in the morning. The house was silent in the way homes only seem to be silent when everyone else is asleep. There were no voices, no television, and no movement from the other rooms. I had been sleeping normally before something caused me to wake up. I do not remember hearing a noise. There was no knock against the glass, no footsteps outside, no voice saying my name. I simply opened my eyes. At first, I was still half asleep. The room was dark, and it took a moment for me to understand what I was looking at. The furniture was nothing more than shadowy shapes. The walls looked different at night, and the window was a dark rectangle against the room. Then, I noticed the figure outside. There was a man standing there. He was looking through my bedroom window. He was not walking past. He was not turned toward the street or looking at the house in general. He was facing me, staring at me. I cannot remember every detail of his face now. I wish I could say exactly what he looked like, what he was wearing, or how old he seemed. But the strongest part of the memory was never his clothing or his features. It was the fact that he was there at all. A strange man was standing outside the window of a sleeping child in the middle of the night. For a few seconds, I could not move. I stared back at him, trying to decide whether I was dreaming. He looked real. He was not a shadow from a tree. He was not a coat hanging inside the room. He was outside the house, visible through the glass, and his attention was fixed on me. The fear hit me so suddenly that it felt physical. My whole body went cold. My chest tightened, and I could hear my heartbeat pounding in my ears. I wanted to scream, but at first I could not make a sound. I remember pulling back into the bed, trying to make myself smaller. The blanket did not feel like protection, but I still wanted to hide under it. Children often believe that if they cover their faces, whatever is frightening them cannot reach them. Part of me knew that was not true, but I did not know what else to do. I was too scared to look away. I kept thinking that if I closed my eyes, he might move closer. He might tap on the window. He might try to open it. He might disappear, which somehow felt almost as frightening, because then I would not know where he had gone. I do not remember exactly how long I saw him. It may have been only a few seconds. It may have been longer. Fear changes time. A short moment can feel endless when you are a child lying alone in the dark. Eventually, the moment ended. I do not remember seeing the man walk away. I cannot clearly recall whether I hid beneath the covers, ran from the room, or called for my parents immediately. The beginning of the memory is sharp, but the ending is confused. What I do remember is that I refused to sleep in that bedroom afterward. For weeks, I slept in my younger sister's room. She was younger than me, but being near her made me feel safer than staying alone. It did not matter that she would not have been able to protect me. I only needed another person in the room. I did not want to face that window again. During the day, it looked ordinary. Sunlight came through it. The glass showed the outside of the house, and there was nothing frightening there. But at night, I could only picture the man. I imagined opening my eyes and seeing him standing in the same place. Sometimes I wondered whether he had been watching before I woke up. That thought was worse than the memory itself. How long had he been there? Had he walked up to the window after I fell asleep? Had he been looking into the room for minutes? Had he been waiting for me to notice him? I did not know. My parents did not believe me. To them, I was a frightened child who had woken from a bad dream. They probably thought I had seen a shadow outside and turned it into a person. Maybe a tree moved. Maybe the light from somewhere nearby created the shape of a man. Maybe I had dreamed the whole thing and woken up believing it was real. Those explanations made sense to adults. They did not make sense to me. I knew the difference between a dream and being awake. I had nightmares before. I understood that dreams could feel real for a few moments after waking, but this did not feel like a dream. I remembered opening my eyes. I remembered seeing the window. I remembered the man looking back at me. The fear did not disappear when I became fully awake. It remained strong enough that I would not sleep in the room for weeks. Still, the adults treated it like imagination. Eventually, I stopped trying to convince them. That did not mean I stopped being afraid. The experience changed the way I slept. Even now, I cannot feel comfortable in a room without curtains. If a window is uncovered at night, I become aware of it immediately. I keep looking toward the glass, even when I know there is probably nothing outside. I do not like seeing darkness beyond a window. During the day, glass feels like a barrier. At night, when the room is lit and the outside is black, the window becomes something else. A person outside can see into the room more clearly than the person inside can see out. That idea still frightens me. I am also still afraid of the dark in ways I do not always like to admit. I can function normally. I can walk through a dark room and be alone at night. I know most fears have ordinary explanations, but part of me is still the child who opened their eyes and saw a man standing outside. The fear never disappeared completely. For years, my mother continued to believe I had imagined it. Whenever the story came up, it was treated like a childhood nightmare. Sometimes it sounded as though she thought I was exaggerating for attention or turning an old dream into something more dramatic. That bothered me. I did not expect her to prove who the man was. I did not expect her to explain why he had been outside. I only wanted her to understand that I was not lying. Recently, we argued about it. I am almost 26 now, and the experience happened many years ago. But I still remembered it clearly enough to become upset when she dismissed it again. I told her I had not been joking. I had not invented the story. I had genuinely seen someone outside the window, or at least I had experienced something so real that it affected me for the rest of my life. During that argument, something finally changed. My mother realized I was serious. She understood that I had not been repeating the story for attention all these years. I was not trying to scare her or make the family believe something supernatural had happened. I had been describing a memory that still frightened me. After so many years, she finally understood that I believed what I had seen. That was not the only strange thing from my childhood that my parents refused to believe. When I was much younger, I also used to talk about my popa and my nan. Both of them had died before I was born. I had never met them. There should have been no personal memories for me to describe. Yet according to my mother, I spoke about them as though I knew them. I knew details about their lives. I mentioned things my parents had never told me. At first, my mother assumed I had overheard adults talking. Children listen more closely than adults realize. They hear family stories from another room, remember names, and later repeat details without knowing where the information came from. That would have been the simplest explanation. But some of the things I said were not stories my parents had discussed around me. I spoke as though I had spent time with my grandparents. I referred to them in a familiar way. I knew personal details that I should not have known. My mother still did not believe there was anything strange happening. She probably thought I was imaginative. Maybe I had mixed together family photographs, stories, and dreams. Maybe I had created imaginary versions of the grandparents I never met. Then I described the farm where my mother had grown up. The property had been a family homestead. It was sold before I was born. I had never visited it. There were no family trips where I could have seen the place as a baby and later forgotten. It was already gone from the family by the time I came into the world. We did not have photographs of it. Either, there was no album I could have opened. No old home video. No framed picture hanging in the house. As far as I know, I had never seen any image of the property. But I described it. I knew the layout in detail. I described the outside railings. I knew which room my mother had grown up in. I described the tree, where she had a swing. These were not broad guesses. I did not simply say there had been a house, a bedroom, and a tree. Most childhood homes have those things. I gave specific details. I described the property closely enough that my mother recognized it. She knew I was talking about the farm from her childhood. I had never been there. The house had been sold before I was born. There were no photographs for me to study. My mother and father had never told me those details. At least, they had never knowingly told them to me. My mother had to confront the fact that I knew something I should not have known. Even then, accepting it was difficult for her. People naturally search for ordinary explanations. Maybe another relative had told me. Maybe I overheard a conversation my parents forgot having. Maybe there had once been a photograph that everyone forgot about. Maybe I asked questions and built the rest of the image from small pieces of information. Any of those things could be possible. Memory is imperfect. Adults forget what they say around children. A single comment can stay in a child's mind for years. Families repeat stories without noticing. But my mother could not remember anyone describing the farm to me in such detail. She knew the property was gone before I was born. She knew I had never stood on that land. Yet I spoke about the railings, her bedroom, and the tree with the swing as though I had seen them. The connection to my popa and nan made it even harder to explain. Both had died before I was born. I had no living memories of them. Still, when I was very young, I spoke about them often. I knew things connected to their lives and to my mother's childhood. I did not speak like someone repeating a history lesson. I spoke naturally, as children do when describing people and places that feel familiar. As I grew older, those conversations stopped. I do not remember everything I said. Most of what I know now comes from the reactions of my family and from the details my mother later confirmed. The memories, if they were memories, faded. I stopped speaking about my grandparents as though they were still present. I stopped describing the farm. Life moved forward, and those childhood experiences became family stories. But they were never fully explained. Sometimes I wonder whether the man outside my window was connected to those other experiences. I have no reason to believe he was my grandfather. I do not remember recognizing him. The sight of him did not feel warm, familiar, or comforting. It terrified me. The experiences may have had nothing to do with each other. One could have been a real stranger outside the house. The other could have been information I learned without remembering how. It would be easy to combine them and create a supernatural explanation, but I do not want to claim more than I know. I only know what happened from my point of view. As a child, I woke up and saw a man staring through my bedroom window. For weeks, I refused to sleep in that room. The fear stayed with me into adulthood. I still need curtains. I am still uneasy in the dark. My parents dismissed it until my mother finally realized, many years later, that I had never been making the story up. And when I was even younger, I spoke about 2 grandparents who died before I was born. I described details of my mother's childhood home, including parts of the property that I had never seen and had no photographs of. The farm was not a vague, imaginary place. It had existed. My mother had lived there. The outside railings were real. The room I described was the room where she had grown up. The tree had really held her childhood swing. I should not have known those things. Perhaps someone told me and forgot. Perhaps I saw something that no one remembers showing me. Perhaps my mind created a place that happened to match the truth. Those are the safest explanations. But sometimes, the safest explanation is not the one that feels most honest. My mother knew how specific the details were. She knew I had never visited the homestead. She knew my Papa and Nan had died before I was born. That was why she struggled to believe me. It was easier to think I was imagining things than to consider how a young child could know so much about people and places from before their birth. I am almost 26 now. Most childhood memories have become weak and incomplete. I have forgotten ordinary days, school lessons, birthdays, and conversations that once seemed important. But I have never forgotten waking in that dark bedroom. I have never forgotten the shape of the man outside the window. I have never forgotten the feeling of being watched. Even when I sleep somewhere unfamiliar today, one of the first things I notice is whether the windows are covered. If there are no curtains, I struggle to relax. I know I am no longer a helpless child. I know doors can be locked and windows can be checked. I know shadows can resemble people. I know dreams can continue for a few seconds after waking. But fear does not always listen to reason. When I see a dark window, part of me expects a face to appear. Part of me expects to open my eyes and find the man standing there again, waiting silently on the other side of the glass. The stories about my grandparents feel different. They are not frightening in the same way. If I truly had some connection to my Papa and Nan, I do not believe they meant me harm. Maybe young children are more open to things adults learn to ignore. Maybe I heard family memories and absorbed them so completely that they felt like my own. Maybe there are parts of memory and family connection that we do not yet understand. I cannot say. My mother could not explain it either. For years, she dismissed both stories. The man was a nightmare. The farm details were imagination. The conversations with my grandparents were childish fantasy. Then I grew up and continued telling the same story. I did not laugh about the man. I did not change the details to make them more dramatic. I still carried the fear. Eventually, my mother realized I had been serious all along. She may not believe everything happened exactly as I remember it. I understand that. I cannot prove any of it. There is no photograph of the man outside the window. There is no recording of me speaking about my grandparents. There are no pictures of the old homestead to compare with my childhood description. The house was sold before I was born, and the people I spoke about were already dead. All that remains are memories. Mine, my mother's, and the details that somehow passed between us, even though no one remembers teaching them to me. Maybe the man at the window was real. Maybe he was a stranger who left before anyone else saw him. That possibility is frightening enough without anything supernatural. Maybe I had a waking nightmare. That would explain why no one else found him, but it would not erase how real the experience felt or how deeply it affected me. Maybe the things I said about my grandparents came from forgotten conversations. Maybe I knew the homestead because a relative described it when I was too young for anyone to think I was listening. That is possible, too. But I still wonder. I wonder how I knew where the railings were. I wonder how I knew which room belonged to my mother. I wonder how I knew about the tree and the swing. I wonder who I believed I was talking to when I spoke to my Popa and Nan. Most of all, I wonder whether children sometimes see or remember things that adults can no longer reach. I do not expect an answer. I have lived with these memories for nearly my entire life. One left me afraid of dark windows. The other left my mother questioning how much a child can know about a past they never experienced. Both were dismissed because I was young. Maybe children are wrong often enough that adults become too comfortable ignoring them. Maybe that is reasonable. Children dream, imagine, misunderstand, and confuse stories with reality. But sometimes a child repeats the same memory for almost 20 years. Sometimes the fear remains long after the room, the window, and the house have been left behind. Sometimes they describe a dead grandparent they never met. Sometimes they describe a home that was sold before they were born. And sometimes, many years later, the adults finally realize the child was never joking.
So that's where we'll stop tonight. Before you go, remember this. Every story you just heard was real. Real people, real nights, and none of them saw it coming. If that got to you the way it gets to most people, do one thing before you leave. Hit subscribe. I post new stories all the time, and I don't want you to miss them. Take care of yourself. I'll see you next time.